fallen by. Is this one of the names? I don't know that this is one of the names.
Which?
Wait a second. I can't. How do I read that?
All right. We're live.
These people, they dance spinning.
That's dervishes.
It's not
Huh?
spin.
No, that's dervish. They are Muslims.
They are?
No, the ones we are speaking about those who spin the dervish.
Who do they pray with?
They spin.
All right.
They go into a trance.
Welcome, folks. So we spoke of Daniel in the lion's den and how people take it as a miracle that the lions didn't devour him. Not only that, they were kind of subdued by him. And in truth, it's not a miracle. God creates the world that animals fulfill their purpose. And the purpose of an animal, like a lion, is to eat other critters, other animals. They will only attack an animal or when they perceive a human being. And my question was, how do they perceive? Well, their vital force that gives them vitality is a spiritual force of klipa, gives them the vitality that as a result of that, they perceive, again, not perception like we perceive in a cognitive manner, right, that they're aware. It's not like they have self-awareness. They don't have self-awareness to begin with, right? We only have that. And where do we get that? By the sin of the tree of knowledge of good and evil. Otherwise, there was only God awareness. And in a sense, that's what they have, is God awareness, but it's klipa, based on klipa, not of holiness. In any case, the point being is that an animal will only attack another animal. But if there's the perception of the animal, of the human, who lives a life like an animal, what does it mean to live a life like an animal? It means you live with your animal soul rather than with your divine soul. You're not aligned with your divine soul, and as a result, that's what the animal perceives. Again, it's not a self-awareness perception. They will attack the human. Daniel, who was a prophet, who was a holy person, who was aligned with the divine to such a degree that the perception of him was a real person. A real person is a divine person. A real person is not just, a nice good guy who, does nice kind things, because together with all those kind things, we do things that are the opposite of holiness, right? But Daniel, who was through and through in every aspect of his being, therefore, the lions can't attack him because their nature is not to attack those that they perceive their humanness in them, their divine in them. And that was perceived. In a regular person like me, it won't be perceived. So I would get attacked by a lion.
Not necessarily. As a matter of fact, yesterday after you had spoken,
Yeah.
I read a story of some girls who were kidnapped, Zambia, I think maybe somewhere in Africa, and they were out in the desert. Lions attacked the kidnappers and killed them, but they protected the girls until they were found.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, there's. Yep.
And this was within the 2000s.
Yeah. Yeah.
So,
Very, okay.
you know,
Yeah, okay. Yeah. There's definitely, that idea. Okay, thank you. Thank you for sharing. Welcome to Tanya Today. I'm Rabbi Ronnie Fine, coming to you Chabad Zich and Kadesh in Montreal, Canada, where it's a privilege and a pleasure to share with you the Tanya. We can conclude today chapter 24, speaking about what it means to be separate from God. How are we separate from God? Is when we do something against the will of God. Since the will of God is the source of vitality, just like the source of my vitality, right? In a sense, on a certain dimension, the source of my vitality is my will. I will to pick up my hand, right? So it was my will that motivated, right? It's ultimately not the source of vitality. It's coming from God, right? But by way of the will, is the will compels, and hey, my hand was picked up because so I willed it, right? So the will of God is what compels and gives vitality to me, to you, to everything. However, when we go against the will of God, God's also giving vitality, right? How so? Not directly from him, not his inner will, but his outer will. That's a means to an end, which is called klipa, a shell that covers over, and that's a energy source, a energy source, if you will, that senses its own independence. Doesn't deny God. Not only doesn't deny God, can't violate God. The embodiment of that in this world was Bilam, right? Bilam said, the prophet, the non-Jewish prophet, said, I can't transgress the word of God. Whatever he tells me, I got to do. The only thing is, he had his own independent sense of being and had his own agenda of what he wanted to accomplish. But he knew at the same time that he can't transgress the word of God. So that's called a God of gods. That's called other gods, right? That you sense your own selfhood, independence, separateness from God, but at the same time, you do recognize God. That's the source of vitality that comes to us when we do something wrong. That's cut off from God, from his holiness. That's cut off from God, from his inner vitality that he gives us as we are receiving right now in the study of Tanya, right? Now, a person might think, well, I'm only going to get cut off if I do something really bad. So here is the mistake that is made. When we say get it cut off from God, we don't mean eternal damnation. We mean in the moment. The moment that you said something inappropriate, the moment that you lifted your hand that you wanted to hurt somebody, inappropriately that you shouldn't, or that you had a bad thought about a family member just because they hurt your feelings and you had negative thoughts towards them. That's also, in that moment of doing whatever the vitality you're getting is cut off from God. And you're cut off from God. The next moment, you could do a mitzvah. Next moment, you could do something good. And you'll get it direct from God's inner will and his holiness, face to face as it were from God. Now, people might make a mistake, though, and think, I know when it comes to idolatry, right? To idolatry, I have to give up my life. That makes sense? Right? Murder, I have to give up my life. But there's other mitzvahs, the observance of Shabbos, I don't have to give up my life. In other words, if I have to, I can desecrate it in order to save my life. If someone is ill, so then you can transgress Shabbos. So we see there's a difference between certain mitzvahs. So idolatry, okay, that I'll never sin. But other things are not on the same level. So it's a very complicated point over here, but there is the value of the thing itself and then the extension of it. So for Shabbos, it pays for the adherence and observance of Shabbos. It pays that you should transgress this Shabbos in order you can keep many other Shabboses. Can't say that about idolatry or murder, for example. So it's not a leniency in Shabbos, though. Not idolatry, no leniency. But Shabbos, there's a leniency. In other things, you might see a leniency. No, it's actually, ultimately, it's a heavenly decree. That's the first point. Second point is, we see in mitzvahs, so in other words, in the moment of doing a transgression, whatever the transgression is, it's a complete cutoff from God in that moment, right? It's a complete cutoff. So there's no distinction whether it's idolatry, Shabbos, or speaking ill. In the moment, a complete cutoff from God. The only distinction that we do see is the effect of it, meaning the after effect, which means the punishment that comes. Some mitzvahs, like if you eat bread on Pesach, there's an early death by the hands of heaven. Other mitzvahs, there's a law of the courts you can be executed by a court even. But that's not about the act itself or the act itself that a person did, that in that moment they get cut off from God. That's about the after effect, the consequence of that act. Some consequences are greater than others. In other words, let me give you an example. Two children are playing on a rainy day in a sandbox. One is acting wild and gets all of the sand and the dirt in their hair and under their fingernails and everything. They're a lot more dirty. The other child, just got a little bit, a little stain on the clothing, a little dirt on the finger. They're both dirty, right? There's both a disconnect, if you will. That's the metaphor I'm using for a disconnect, right? They both need a cleansing, but one needs a greater cleansing than the other, right? One needs minor and the other needs major. But that's only the after effect. That's only the after effect, the consequence of the sin, that some sins carry a greater punishment and some carry a lesser punishment. But in the moment of the act, they're both cut off from God. The vitality that you're receiving is a vitality that's coming from Klippa, that's coming from the shell that's covering over. It's coming from that place that we call Sitra Acher. There is no distinction. Now, what's amazing is you're cut off from God, but are you still connected to God? Yes. In a way that it's in exile. Your connection is there, but it's kind of like imprisoned. It's in exile, right? That the animal soul is creating that exile. But even though there's an exile, even in the moment of doing sin, you have a perfect faith in God and a connection to God. A perfect faith in God, a perfect connection, but that perfect connection is in exile now. And there's no greater exile than the exile of the divine soul within the animal soul that is brought on by sin. It's like a plunge from the lofty rooftop to a deep pit. It's metaphorically, it's comparable to taking the king's head and putting it into a bucket of filth, right? Of excrement, if you will, whatever it is. That's a great humiliation for taking the king, and the king in you is your divine soul. So you're taking the king in you and putting it into this place of filth. Now, that's just for the moment of doing the actual transgression. Again, the moment later that you're gonna, if you do a mitzvah, so then that's a different story, right? But the reality is, in that moment, there's a disconnect, a complete disconnect, whether it's a small dirt, small transgression, or a big transgression. They are all equal in the disconnect in that moment. In that moment. It's very powerful. Any questions, any comments, any thoughts? Jeff, as I listen to this, I'm trying to understand when in real life example that would occur, and when it did happen, when the Alter Rebbe wrote the Tanya and save a life example. Not exactly clear on what the question is, Jeff. So let's right. If I'm if I'm speaking ill to another person, if I'm denigrating, a family member, the power for me to do that is coming from God. Everything is from God, but that power is not coming from direct His divine holiness from His inner will. It's coming from His outer will. It's coming from Klippa that covers over on the divine. That's what's happening at that moment, right? In that moment, there's a disconnect. The save the life example is, you want to make a distinction that Shabbos is not so, is not so severe as idolatry. So idolatry, oh yeah, that you're going to stay away from. You're never going to sin. But Shabbos obviously is not so severe because you could desecrate the Shabbos if someone wasn't well, to a certain degree, depending on the point of, the illness of the individual. So you could desecrate Shabbos. That's not showing of the inherent value of Shabbos. It's just because of other considerations that we consider. Therefore, you desecrate the Shabbos when a person's ill, that in order they can observe many Shabbos in the future. Okay. Any other questions? I don't see any questions here. Wonderful. Folks, today we begin Rambam all anew.
Today you start Rambam all over again.
Yep, all over again, exactly. All right. Here, don't see. Thank you for joining. God bless.